but I am going to bring on my guests. Bryce Green. Bryce Green is a journalist for FAIR, and he wrote an incredible paper called What You Should Really Know About Ukraine. Anyway, you wrote a fantastic article. The reason why you're here, ironically, besides a great article, is that one of the people that works with me said, geez, Steve, this guy, he wrote an article. It sounds like the take you did the other day when you were discussing Ukraine, especially from the perspective of the IMF and the role that the desire to make Ukraine a very, very comfy place to do business. Obviously, there's a lot more in your article than that, and I want to get into that. But this does seem to be a common theme, especially in developing nations. And while Ukraine doesn't look like a developing nation, has long history of being an industrial power back in the days of the Soviet Union, it is developing. It has not caught up with a lot of the rest of Europe, and it definitely didn't catch up with Russia. So here you've got a community that is really ripe for the picking. And who else is there? We're from the IMF, and we're here to help. I mean, talk to me about your article, man. Start with the IMF, though, if you don't mind, then we can get into the deeper stuff.
Right. So I wrote the article mostly because I was watching all these tensions going around Ukraine, watching U.S. intelligence agencies talk about Russia's buildup, watching other countries deny it, watching U.S. media try to talk about what happened to get us to this point. And one thing that I noticed that was missing is that people missed the U.S. influence that led us here. One of the main things that happened that led us here, that led to the civil war in Ukraine, that led subsequently to the Russian invasion, was the U.S. hand in overthrowing the government in 2014. Now, understanding why that overthrow happened is extremely important. Understanding that it happened by itself is super important because the media refuses to talk about it, as they do with most of America's imperial endeavors. But understanding why it happened, I think, gives a great deal of insight into how U.S. imperialism functions, like on a practical level. And one of the main reasons that the United States tried to, or successfully, helped overthrow the government in Ukraine was that they wanted to make Ukraine a more hospitable to Western investors. If you look at some of the IMF documents, real quick, I don't know if your listeners know what the IMF is, if your viewers know what the IMF is. You
go ahead, talk about it a little bit. I mean, I'm happy to fill in, but you're the guest. Go ahead, man.
But yeah, in short, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, was set up as part of the Bretton Woods system after World War II. Essentially, it pulls together all these funds from Western capital and Western governments, and then ostensibly loans money to developing countries to help them develop. It gives them access to capital they wouldn't otherwise have. Now, this is nice. A development bank, an international development bank, is a good idea, and helping countries with their balance of payments if they need dollars to buy U.S. imports is a good idea. But in practice, it functions much more as a tool of Western capital and Western governments to enrich themselves. One of the excellent books on this is, or one of the many ones, is Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein, in which she talks about how much, or how U.S. policy and IMF policy essentially floods these countries with loans, but they make them make concessions if they want to get those loans, and those concessions usually involve restructuring the economy to make it more friendly to Western investors. It means cutting the education sector, cutting the publicly owned sector, and privatizing it, which would allow Western investors to come in and swoop up those assets, and therefore they would own the country.
Absolutely. I mean, you look at Haiti. I mean, they do stuff like this there. You look at South America. They have done this there. And the other book that I would like everyone to definitely please read it is The Divide by Jason Hickel. And he goes into incredible detail about the structural adjustments that they apply to everywhere they go with the full intention of liberalizing markets and making them very cushy for the extraction process that occurs. I mean, this is the business model of neoliberalism, and the U.S. is the chief driver of said neoliberalism. It just doesn't make any sense why people don't understand this more. It is right there in our faces everywhere we look. And Ukraine is going to be uh, I believe it's like the fountainhead, it's the epicenter, if you will, of a very huge global geopolitical battle, where right there on the border, you've got the European Union looking into Ukraine because Ukraine is the breadbasket of Europe. And you've got Russia over here looks at Ukraine as not only a pass through for their pipelines, but also a major food producer and lots of real resources that come out of there. I mean, I believe the statistics are like they're 12% of the full export of grains come out of Ukraine. And there's ore of all kinds from titanium, lithium, all kinds of important things, stuff meant for semiconductors. And if you remember how bad a shortage we had of semiconductors during this pandemic, you understand that the stuff coming out of Ukraine is very valuable, even though they don't necessarily have all the industrial capacity at this point, the industrial sovereignty, the production sovereignty, if you will, to do it on their own. That's why they're in bed with the IMF. That's why the IMF even is in there, because they don't have that full spectrum of sovereignty. They have currency sovereignty, but they don't have production sovereignty.
Exactly. And one of the main things that is keeping people from really understanding this is that they use language that, if you're raised in the imperial core here in America, that you're taught to see as good things. Like when they don't say that they're going to go in there and privatize markets. Well, sometimes they do. They'll say it in like congressional hearings. They'll talk amongst themselves and say it. But that's not really how they sell their policy to the public. What they call it is democracy promotion. And what they mean by democracy is something very specific. It's very different than the dictionary definition of democracy. What the dictionary definition is giving people, average people, a greater say in how their world is run. But the Washington definition, the IMF, the neoliberal definition, is simply to make make the world safe for capital. If markets don't have as many rules on them, that by definition is more democratic. And so when you have giant multinational corporations come in and buy up your country, well, by the IMF standards, you would be a burgeoning democracy, which obviously doesn't make any sense, but that is how it's sold to the public. And so one of the key institutions for this democracy promotion is called the National Endowment for Democracy, which is essentially, I believe the Washington Post described it as doing what the CIA used to do in private, but only in public, democracy promotion.
We for this particular show, for our discussion here, I want to focus specifically on the historical aspects that you found to be credible and important to notice and understand, especially about the various coups and revolutions within Ukraine that kind of led up to some of the geopolitical struggle that led up to this.
Right. So I guess you could start the story, like you said, back in the czars. But I think the best place, the most manageable place to start it is at the end of the Cold War. At the end of the Cold War, the USSR dissolved. It broke up into its constituent parts. And Russia was, a country, but they were still a nuclear armed superpower. And so we had to make deals with them about how to reshape the post Cold War security apparatus. One of the main things that came out of that was a deal with the U.S. and Russia not to expand NATO after the induction of East and West Germany, the reunification of East and West Germany. Germany would be added to NATO, but it wouldn't expand not 1 inch east. But pretty quickly, Washington reneged on their promise and started adding countries to NATO, like Poland, Hungary, all these formerly Warsaw Pact or Soviet adjacent countries began joining this hostile military alliance. And US planners, Russian planners, any historian will tell you that Russia absolutely considers Ukraine to be one of its key security assets. They've been invaded through Ukraine many times. But the US, they've been trying to wrest Ukraine from the Russian sphere of influence and put it squarely in their own. Since 1991, according to at least some U.S. officials, the U.S. has spent about $5 billion promoting democracy, as they say. trying to affect Ukrainian civil society, trying to fund media organizations, trying to reorient the politics of that country to be more pro-Western. In 2004, we sent in advisors and started funding media operations to help, try and reshape the candidates that were going to be in that election. We didn't fully get them in our orbit, but those NED projects, they continued on that path. And going back to the IMF long had plans for Ukraine. They wanted to privatize the industry. They wanted to reduce their education sector, their public health sector, which, by the way, were the two most employing sectors of the public economy in Ukraine. And they wanted to cut heating subsidies, like natural gas subsidies for the people. So, the Ukrainians, they had given that to their people, like many other former Warsaw Pact countries, in order to help their people stay warm. But the IMF said that, no, that's not efficient. We should probably get rid of that. And so the IMF and the Western Bloc, they were offering a package to the Ukrainian president, Viktor Yanukovych, in 2013. Now, Yanukovych, corrupt guy. There's no getting around that. Most high level politicians, probably all over the world, but especially in that region, are generally corrupt in some sense. But the Russians, and he had good relations with Russia, and the Russians, they offered Yanukovych a package, an economic integration package, to counter the European EU IMF integration package. Well, the Russians, Yanukovych, chose the Russian package, and instantly you saw all these protests start to come to life. They started taking to the Maidan Square in Kiev, and the National Endowment for Democracy, the organizations that were funded by by the NED, they sprung into action. Their network sprung into action, and they raised things to a fever pitch, to a point that Yanukovych was overthrown. Now, there's a lot more to that story that I can get into later, but in essence, this coup, this overthrow, was instigated because a president, a democratically elected president, turned away from IMF policies and chose a pro-Russia approach. That's unacceptable to Western planners.
Thanks for watching, and make sure to tune in to Status Coup's daily live stream Monday through Thursday at 5 o'clock Eastern Time and Fridays at 4 o'clock Eastern Time.